Hello and welcome to a special edition of Strange Audio Parts. In this episode, I'll be answering questions from my patrons. The full-length, ad-free version is available to anyone with a membership on Patreon or YouTube. Now, before I get accused of paywalling content, let me say this. The biggest difference is the lack of ads. Although, a few responses are shortened, and I did skip a few questions here and there. Okay, that's enough integrated self-promotion. Let's get to the questions. Trev Goldring asks, did you ever read Black Monday Murders? Yes, I have read it, well, part of it. When it began, it experienced some noticeable delays, and I dropped out, waiting for Jonathan Hickman to finish it. And then I forgot about it. But I see the storyline is wrapped up, so now I'll get back to it. Obviously, I've not read the entire thing, but it was pretty interesting as an occult type of story. It seemed a little reminiscent of his early work, like the Nightly News or Transhuman. I mean, thematically, in the sense that it tackled corporate-controlled interests. Alex Kennedy asks, if you could supervise a new edition, design, format, etc. for any out-of-print series, what would it be and how would you do it? I'd find all of Steve Ditko's work from the 90s until his passing in 2008 and preserve that. He did a fair amount of illustrated essays during that time, and the vast majority of them are out of print and very, very hard to locate. I think that work needs to be preserved, especially since Ditko's perspective on various aspects of the industry is basically unknown. So those works may contain some undiscovered insight that should be recorded. As a format, I'd probably do a cost-effective traditional comic in black and white, but I'd also make it available in an equally cost-effective digital format. Dr. Spiderface has a few questions. Do you have any comic YouTube/podcasts that you really admire? Admire is a pretty strong word, and I'm somewhat hard to impress, to be honest. But for podcasts, I'd have to say Word Balloon by John Suntress, mainly because he's been doing it forever, and he's had some fairly long conversations with comic book personalities. As for YouTubers, I can't say I admire anyone, which sounds very negative, but I don't mean it to be, not even a little. As a broad generalization, I have a slight admiration for anyone who can talk into a camera. That's something I can't do. I can barely talk into a microphone coherently without feeling crushing self-awareness. Or perhaps anyone who makes a living actually discussing the medium and what is worthwhile, rather than pandering to trends and drama baiting under the pretense of loving comics without ever discussing what they enjoy. The second question is, what's your most controversial opinion? As soon as I mention that opinion, people are going to be asking me to elaborate, and I probably will at a later time. That opinion is, the end of Tom King and Mitch Geraud's Mr. Miracle is irresponsible. That's something for everyone to chew on. I'm sure some will run with that and try to figure out what I mean. And the good doctor's final question is, what series do you absolutely hate, like loathe with a burning passion? Like admire, hate is a pretty strong term. At worst, I usually feel strong ambivalence. I think the only thing I can say that I did hate was, specifically, the final page of Wanted. That felt like a direct insult to the readers from Mark Miller. It was like, thanks for the money, suckers. It felt very crass, childish, and intentionally demeaning to the readers. Secret Comics Cabal President Gary Box has two questions. Question 1. You can trade one hero from DC to Marvel and vice versa. What two heroes are switching places? I would switch Superman with Moon Boy and Devil Dinosaur. Since you didn't ask for a justification, I'll leave it at that. Question 2. Your local Secret Comics Cabal is forced to silence dissenters who think Stan Lee created Batman. How much did you see, and why is it nothing? As a Secret Cabal president, you know very well I can't discuss that topic, or acknowledge the question when it's asked. So what I and Elizabeth Olsen witnessed, or whether we saw the aforementioned nothing, has to remain unaddressed. Other guy asks, have you ever thought of reviewing manga? Oh, I have, just not extensively. But those videos do terribly, which I find perplexing, considering how often people ask for more manga coverage and its overall popularity. I'd expect more views, instead I get noticeably less. So that's one reason why you don't get regular manga-based videos. But that doesn't mean I won't cover more in the future, it's just not a priority. Alex Hunter asks, since this just happened, what are your thoughts on Bill Willingham putting the Fables IP into the public domain? What do you think the possible ramifications will be? Naturally, I have to preface this by saying I'm not a legal expert. But my understanding is that a copyright owner cannot declare their work is now public domain. That's not a provision in copyright law. Again, that's my understanding. I could be wrong. Secondly, I'm not sure if anyone has pointed this out yet. Someone must have by the time I record this and upload it, but those characters are already public domain. If you wanted to do a story involving the Big Bad Wolf, Cinderella, Snow White, or Rose Red, for example, you definitely 100% don't need Bill Willingham's permission. There may be unique characteristics one might want to avoid, such as the name Fabletown, or Bigby's detective skills, or the overall plot, but otherwise you're good to go. It's not even subverting copyright. These are characters that already exist in the public domain. Anyone, anywhere can use them. That being said, the story is copyright, so you can't just rewrite what Willingham has done. But using the characters? No problem. The only ramification I can see is the remaining Fables issues being cancelled and Willingham not working for DC for the remainder of his life. In an overall sense, I don't see this affecting anyone else. Brad Elmore asks a few questions. Question 1. General thoughts on From Hell. Generally, it's a great piece of work by Moore and Campbell. I like everything he explored in it, and the storytelling was pretty tight. I just wish it wasn't a story based on Jack the Ripper. Even so, despite the subject being done to death, no pun intended, he found a good story to tell. Question 2. Gilbert or Jaime, you can love-hate both, but gun to your head, do you like or prefer one over the other? If I had to choose, Jaime. I can't give up Maggie and Hopi or that supporting cast. Question 3. How did Jeff Loeb, who is terrible, pull off Superman for all seasons? Honestly, I'm not sure how to respond, mainly because I don't remember that miniseries. But it may be because Superman gets a lot of respect, and when a writer gets the opportunity to handle that character, they go in with their A+ game. Question 4. Any thoughts on Paul Pope? Paul Pope is awesome. I wish I could get my hands on a complete set of THB, but it has eluded me thus far. And finally, have you read Ultra Mega? If not, why not, gosh darn it? I have not read Ultra Mega, and the reason I haven't is because I'm busy making videos about stuff I have read. Cast Iron Chaos says, I'd like to see a mention of Destroy, the loudest comic book in the universe, from Scott McCloud, the guy who wrote Understanding Comics. This was a one-shot black and white comic full of nothing but full-size single-panel pages. The story consisted of two costume muscle-bound characters beating the crap out of each other and destroying the entire city around them. It was a one-joke satire or parody of superheroes, but I think it was a good joke and it worked okay as a one-shot single-issue comic. Well, that's more of a comment or request rather than a question, but hey, Destroy is a comic. It exists. Like you said, it was one joke played out over a long time. It was oversized too, if I remember correctly. Zach Kleinfelter asks, I was curious on your thoughts on Grant Morrison's writing style. I personally think he is my favorite comic writer, but I have a hard time finding flaws or imperfections with his stories. Or at least his more modern works like his X-Men run and All-Star Superman. Before there are numerous comments, I've looked into this pronoun situation, and Morrison is completely ambivalent about the pronouns one uses to refer to them. So they/them is equally as valid as he/him. There's a link to a video in the description one can watch for Morrison's opinion on the matter. Anyway, like any writer, Morrison does have his flaws. But over the years, they've honed the craft they put into the work, so the flaws are easy to overlook. And pointing them out can come off as nitpicky. The flaw that always stands out to me is, he expects the reader to engage immediately with the material instead of drawing them in before layering on subtext and symbolism. In part, that's respecting the reader's intelligence, which is a good thing, but it also presumes the reader is invested in the story from panel 1. Perhaps, at this point in their career, that's a reasonable presumption. However, if someone new picks up, say, Final Crisis or Multiversity, for example, the reader is going to be wondering what is going on and might not be inclined to dig deeper, or, for that matter, continue with the comic. In other words, Morrison's flaw is not finding a balance between symbolism and actual, straightforward storytelling. Or put another way, they usually have an interesting concept or premise as a foundation, and then they explore that idea, rather than writing a story around it. The aforementioned Final Crisis and Multiversity fit into this category. I would also say Seven Soldiers does too. Again, kind of nitpicky, and I'm certain many will disagree and tell me I don't get what Morrison is doing. Steve White asks, censorship in comics in the USA is well documented. I am curious if there is any Canadian censorship in comics that we Americans may not be familiar with. Yes, there is. The video about Void Indigo details some of the censorship that's in place within Canada. Anecdotally, I have heard and read about stores getting raided in Canada for having adult comics, and then being prosecuted for violating obscenity laws, or for selling smut to children, even though the people who bought the item were adults. It doesn't appear to be much of an issue nowadays, but it was not uncommon in years past. John Gaunt asks, what are your opinions on crowdfunded comics? How do you think such crowdfunding changes the traditional one-man companies or small publishers? I'm good with crowdfunded comics as long as those taking other people's hard-earned money deliver their product on time and as promised. Doing the opposite ruins the process and causes skepticism and cynicism from the public, not just for a specific creator, but for all who crowdfund material. Personally, I don't think it changes any existing models. It's simply an addition. It's self-publishing in the 21st century, except for the creators involved, the risk of investment is removed. Although in my opinion, and my slight knowledge concerning the cost of production, the goals some begin with are, let's say, overly generous. Overall, I'm good with the creator having ultimate control of their property and reaping the full benefit. I just wish everyone took it as a deadly serious responsibility between themselves and their audience. Christopher Olichny asks, you have not kept away from covering controversial comic book creators. So what is your opinion on Chuck Austen? Do you find any redeeming qualities in his work? Unfortunately, I'm not overly familiar with Chuck Austen's career. I mean, I know some people consider him controversial, but I've never looked into the topic, or for that matter, read any of his work that I can think of. In other words, I literally have no idea what makes him controversial, so I have no opinion. Colin Taylor has a few questions. Question 1. Can you just switch off and just read comics for fun, or do you always approach them with an analytical eye since starting the podcast? Technically, it's not a podcast, it's a video essay type of thing. Okay, so this video is actually a podcast, but putting that aside, that's a good question. I absolutely read comics just to enjoy them. I would say the first time I read something, that's all I'm doing, just reading. Once I get to the end, then I might think, well, that might be something I'd like to talk about. It's not until I sit down to write about a comic that the analysis comes out. The majority of my thinking comes out while writing a script. Question 2. Has doing the podcast changed the way you read comics in any other ways? That's another good question, and one I had to think about. I think the biggest change is finding evidence, or lack thereof, to support or change an opinion that's formed while reading the material. As an example, maybe I thought a plot point came out of nowhere, and it was a writer trying to be all clever and stuff. In that situation, I'd look at what preceded that plot point and see if there was foreshadowing or little hints that a reveal was on its way. Because, like any human being, sometimes there's subtleties I miss along the way. So I let the artwork and writing dictate my point of view, rather than cherry-picking what I think supports my pre-formed opinion. Sometimes I'm wrong, sometimes I'm right. Either way, that's how I form an opinion that I then put into a video. Not the opinion I think someone needs to hear, because that's the one I originally started with. And finally, you've mentioned Judge Dredd before in a Q&A, but have you read any 2000 AD beyond that? I've read a basic amount of 2000 AD, which includes Tharg's Kingdom and Future Shocks. Enough to say I'm familiar with it, but not an expert. Maybe one day I'll sit down and do a heavy read of the material. Donut Fists also has a few questions. Question 1. What was it like to experience the start of the modern age? Baby boomers all seem to remember where they were when they heard Kennedy was assassinated or the Beatles played on Sullivan. I can only guess that, as a comic reader, picking up Dark Knight Returns or an issue of Watchmen had a similar, though maybe not as immediate effect. On a strictly personal level, and not as a Generation X spokesperson, it was cool to see my favorite medium grow up and gain some respectability. I wouldn't say it was as earth-shaking or immediate as a presidential assassination. It was a change that developed over a number of years. There's definitely more than a few videos on this channel about that time, which are basically me looking back and trying to sort out exactly what happened to cause that shift. But as I've said in the past, everyone's era of entry is usually their favorite time. It's why there are people who still love early Image comics to this day. So clearly, I'm going to be biased towards a time when I was metaphorically growing up alongside my favorite medium. And there's an attachment that's difficult to convey to others that didn't experience that time. But I'm sure there are others in the audience who can relate to what I'm saying. Question 2. What was happening culturally that made Vertigo such a flashpoint? And was it poor leadership that led to its downfall? Vertigo was an answer to all the piles and piles of similar garbage Marvel, DC, and Image were cranking out. While Vertigo had its share of duds, it was, at least, different than the piles of superhero material flooding the market. That's what made it a flashpoint. Poor leadership might not have been the issue with Vertigo, although it may have contributed near the end. I really do think Image and its creator-friendly terms killed off Vertigo more than anything. Final question, piggybacking off the previous question, are there any authors or publishers you feel are pushing things in a similar direction now? From what I can see, there isn't anyone pushing in that direction. For the most part, it's maintenance, it's staying the course. Image may have the appearance of flying that particular flag, but that's definitely by accident rather than design. Christopher Lichny comes back to ask, comic stories used to be told in monthly issues with long gestating subplots and what appeared to be no one all-encompassing storyline. Today, they are mostly told in segmented chapters, intended to be collected into larger volumes containing one complete story. In your opinion, which format is superior? How do you prefer to read comics, monthly issues or complete stories? There is no superior format, although I would refine that comment a bit. The story should dictate the format and not the other way around. It would be disingenuous to suggest that some stories aren't padded to fit 6 issues, which is then converted to a trade paperback. In my opinion, there should be a lot more variety in story length. 2, 3, or 4 issue arcs is what I mean. Because not every plot beat needs 6 issues to breathe. It's formulaic and it needs to be used sparingly. For me, I read arcs. I don't read monthly anymore. I don't get a thrill from a monthly comic that's merely a slice of a story that's going to take 6 months to finish. Mind you, that's something I've done for decades now, since the mid to late 90s actually. Philip McKinnon has a few questions to ask. I wonder if you return to specific comics/stories at different points in your life. For example, I return to some of the Sandman stories. There are aspects about change in them that resonate with me and sometimes help me move on. Honestly, not so much. For me, that role seems to be filled by movies. Maybe you've spoken about this at some point, but do you have a huge collection, or do you read digital comics? I like paper. To give you an indication of the size of my collection, both past and present, I'm reasonably certain almost everything I've discussed I've had in print form at one point in my life, or I currently have it in my possession. However, I exclusively read digitally nowadays. A lot of that has to do with practicality and ease. For practical reasons, I need digital copies for the videos I make, and it's easy for me to load 100 issues of something onto my iPad and have them conveniently available to read, as opposed to pulling out my long boxes, finding the right one, pulling out the stack I need, and so on. Did you ever write to a letter column in a comic? Nope, not once. Supervader asks, will you be doing a video on any of the Doom Patrol series post-Rachel Pollack? The series written by John Arcudi, the John Byrne series, the Keith Giffen series, and the Gerard Way series. The short answer is, yes, I will, at some point, return to covering the other Doom Patrol series. Oddly, the next question, and my response, sort of addresses why I've not done this quite yet. Daniel Von Eggedy has a few questions to ask. Question 1. Will you be continuing your event series, or has that concluded? DC's event cycle, from the lead up to Infinite Crisis through Flashpoint, is pretty interesting. Eventually, yes. Things like that I do in pieces because, honestly, I get bored at different points in the process. So I need a breather before I stop caring about what I'm reading. DC events will definitely be a topic for later. Question 2. Have you paid any attention at all to Jeff Johns' post-Doomsday Clock DC work? I'm getting a really bitter vibe from the whole thing. I really haven't followed his output after Doomsday Clock. I did read a few issues of Junkyard Joe, but it read like a G.I. Robot reboot that DC passed on. Otherwise, I really don't have an opinion on the vibe he has going on. Question 3. Did you manage to stick with X-Men in any way following House of X? No, I didn't. I dropped out because of the amount of interrelated titles and a lack of interest. And finally, any plans to cover the Simonson Thor run? Nothing planned at the moment, but it's an interesting run. Sebastian Castellano asks, do you think that YA comics is more the future of the medium and that single issues will go out of fashion? Well, I would argue young adult comics have dominated the medium for decades, but I would guess you mean things published in a single volume, usually from a book publisher, not Marvel or DC. That's a tough one to answer, and it's cyclical. I mean, young adult audiences wax and wane as one generation moves on and another grows up. So trying to predict what the next generation will prefer is difficult. If I had a really good guess at what happens in the future, I'd likely be a wealthy consultant, instead of, a YouTube guy. There might always be a place for single-issue stuff. The biggest thing working against it is the price. It's really hard to justify $5 for 24 pages of material that provide roughly 10 minutes of entertainment. The cost of physical copies is kind of excessive. In order for print to survive, they have to find some way to offset the cost of each issue and get the price down to something more reasonable. I don't see that happening. Without getting into a half-hour discussion about this very involved question, I can only state with some confidence there are cultural shifts and business decisions that will happen over the next 10 years or so that will determine the outcome of the print industry. Alright, that brings us to the end of the questions. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question for this disembodied voice to answer. And as always, thanks for your continuing support, whether that be on Patreon, YouTube, or through views and comments. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you. Extra special thanks goes to Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Marc-Antoine Martinetti, Johnny Lim, Steve White, Taylor Dull, Zach Kleinfelter, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. And they drive an ice cream van.